Welcome to helpyourmath.com. In this video, we're going to look at examples of finding the midpoint between 2 points and also finding the distance between 2 points. Before we get started with the examples, let's just review the two formulas that we're going to need. To calculate the midpoint between 2 points, and usually when we refer to these points, we call them x sub 1, y sub 1, that's just the first ordered pair, and x sub 2, y sub 2. So the midpoint between these points would be calculated. The midpoint is the average of the points. So you would add up the x coordinates to figure out the x coordinate of the midpoint. So we add them up and divide by 2. We add up the y coordinates and divide by 2. Notice that the midpoint itself is also a point, and it should be the point that's exactly halfway between them on the line segment that connects them. The distance between 2 points, remember we can always derive the distance formula from Pythagorean theorem, so if it's easier to graph it to get a visual, you can by all means use Pythagorean theorem. But the distance formula looks a little scary. We say distance is equal to the square root. This time we look for the difference, x2 minus x1 quantity squared plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. And it doesn't matter within here if you put x2 minus x1 or x1 minus x2, because those two numbers are opposites of each other, and when you go to square it, it's going to end up being the positive version. So either way, it doesn't matter. Okay, on to the examples. In our first example, we have 2 points, 4, -1, and 10, -9. If it helps, label them. So we're going to call this one x1, y1, and we're going to call this ordered pair x2, y2. Now to calculate the midpoint, remember that's going to be the point that's halfway between them. So we're going to add up the x coordinates, that would be 4 plus 10, and divide by 2. Add up the y coordinates, -1 plus -9, and divide by 2. Let's simplify this. 4 plus 10 is 14 over 2. -1 plus -9 is -10 over 2. So the midpoint will be found at 7, -5. The distance between these points, so we're going to say the distance, that's going to be the square root of x2, 10 minus x1, 4 quantity squared plus, right, that's like a squared, then b squared would be -9 minus -1, the difference between the y coordinates, quantity squared, and then we take the square root of the whole thing, so that way the d is by itself instead of it being d squared. Now let's simplify this. 10 minus 4 is 6, so that would be 6 squared, plus -9 minus -1 will be -8. That minus negative becomes plus positive squared. So we end up with 36 plus 64, the square root of that. That's the square root of 100, which is 10. So we end up with a distance of 10. In our next example, we have the ordered pairs 2, -5 and -2, 8. Again, if you want to, you can label these x1, y1 and x2, y2. To calculate the midpoint, I'm just gonna label it MP. We would add up the x coordinates, 2 plus -2, and divide by 2. To find the y coordinate of the midpoint, we will add up the y coordinates and divide by 2. Let's simplify these. 2 plus -2 is 0, and 0 over 2 is 0. We'll simplify in just a second. Then here we get 3 over 2. 0 over 2 is 0, and 3 over 2, you can leave 3 over 2, or you can convert it to a mixed number, 1 1/2, or you can convert it to a decimal, 1.5. The distance between these 2 points, that's going to be the square root of 2 minus -2 squared. Oops, sorry, I did it backwards from what I said the formula was, so I'll rewrite it. But again, that's okay that I did that. It would still give me the same answer. But since I said x2 minus x1, I'll be consistent. So -2 minus 2 quantity squared plus 8 minus -5 squared. This is going to give me -2 minus 2 is -4, -4 squared, plus 8 minus -5 would be positive 13 squared. All right, squaring each of these, -4 quantity squared is 16, 13 squared is 169. When I add 16 plus 169, I end up with 185. 185, I don't believe, has any perfect square factors. 4 doesn't go into it, 9 doesn't go into it, 16 wouldn't go into it, 25 doesn't go into it, 36 doesn't go into it, 49 doesn't go into it, after 49 would be 64, no. 81, no. So this is going to be our distance. So the distance is going to be the square root of 185. In our last example, we have the ordered pairs -3, -5, and 9, -12. We're going to call this one x1, y1, and this one x2, y2. To find the midpoint, again, we add up the x-coordinates for the x-coordinate of the midpoint, so that's -3 plus 9, and divide by 2. To find the y-coordinate of the midpoint, add the y-coordinates together and divide that by 2. So this would be 6 over 2, comma, -17 over 2. 6 over 2 is 3. -17 over 2 is -8.5. -8.5 is also fine. Probably -17 over 2 is also fine. So the midpoint is 3, -8.5. The distance here, we're going to take the square root of x2, 9, minus x1, -3, quantity squared, plus y2, -12, minus y1, -5, quantity squared. And we end up with 9 minus -3 is +12, so that's 12 squared, plus -12 minus -5 is -7, -7 squared. 12 squared is 144, 7 squared is 49. When I add these together, I end up with the square root of 193. 193 is prime, so we cannot simplify it any further. So the distance would be the square root of 193.